This conference will now be recorded.
And I'm going to hide the screen that tells me who's on, so that I can actually see what's on my slides. And we will commence. Now, as always, at the end of today, I will circulate these slides, and that will be after the second one of these webinars. And please feel free to share them within your organizations. The group has been growing quite a lot over the last few days. Sorry, my slides have now frozen. And you'll see from this graph, which for those who've not been on this before, we always start with this little graphic here. It lists sort of who's in the group. We've reached 50 countries now. And a key one is that we've got Russia. This week, Russia has joined us. So if you're on this call, I'm delighted to have you. I'm not quite sure what hello is in Russian. I've actually put the city there. It's from Khabarovsk, which is on the very far east of Russia. So great to have you join us. And you can see that the group continues to grow. Could I just ask, if you're not on mute, could you put yourself on mute? There's a little bit of noise coming back. We always start with a little infographic, and this is the one I'd like to share for this week. It's from SEWA, the Sharjah Energy and Water Authority in the UAE, and it's their benchmarking on COVID-19. It's a really good graphic, I think, because it sort of catches the 7 main points, but in particular, it's making the point around evolution. We're moving into a new world here where actually survival of organizations and just the sort of mental survival of individuals is all about flexibility. It's about our ability to adapt. You can see here those points 5, 6, and 7. It's around the importance of transferable skills, the importance of flexible working, and the bit I particularly like is utility co-learning is more important than ever, which obviously resonates particularly with this particular forum, because it's all about sharing best practice between utilities. So a great infographic there. The agenda for the next 15, 20 minutes or so is to cover these things. We'll do a little bit at the beginning on exiting lockdown, looking at 3 countries and what they're doing, or 3 utilities within 3 countries. There's then the highlights from the week, and I've changed that from questions that have been raised to highlights from the week, because we're getting not just questions from on the WhatsApp chat, but we're also getting direct feedback on email, because some people find that an easier way to share bulky information. And then we've also got a little session on the subgroups that have been set up this week. So they're the 3 main things I'm going to cover. And on the highlights of the week, I've listed the titles, but you'll see those when they come up. So moving to exiting lockdown. This was shared by King Ramos in the Philippines, who works for Maniliad Water. And they've created a 4-page guideline checklist. This time yesterday, they were looking for approval for being able to share their checklist. And they told us how they built it up, but they teased us. They told us how they built it up, but they weren't able to actually share the document. I'm delighted to say that overnight, that 4-page checklist has been shared, and it's available on the OneDrive folder, and the link is here. What's great about this document is they've actually tapped into multiple resources that are not just utility specific. Some are around small businesses and some are around things that are utility specific. They've gone to Canada, America, the UK. They've gone to various places to pull together this best practice document. And it's also sort of utility specific and for business general specific. And it's all around the sort of continuity plan. So a really good document to refer to. Second example I'd like to pull in is from Anglian Water in the UK, and Shauna shared this, which is around the considerations for entering the office, for going back into offices as we remobilize. And there's some lovely points here. Some of them are obvious things, but actually the ones that came to me was understanding the reliance of individuals on public transport, because that obviously affects the risk that they're bringing into the organization. And then if you look at that last bullet point, risk assessments being developed to consider the following, they've picked off a few things here that are around, how good is your air conditioning unit? Have you got isolation rooms? If someone arrives at work and then exhibits systems, you need to be able to isolate them. Have you got the capability to do that? and have you actually split your key workforces so that you haven't got cross-contamination? So some really good sort of thoughts there around how to make sure remobilization is safe. And then here's the last one of these exiting lockdown examples is from Tasmania. And as I mentioned last week, Michael Brewster, the chief executive of TasWater, kindly shared his board paper outlining how they were intending to recover from COVID-19 and essentially reinvent themselves. If anyone wants a copy of that paper, you're more than welcome to it. It's not available on download. You actually have to email me directly and then I'll send it to you. And we've had just over 40 utilities, 41 I think it is, who've requested that. So it's been very popular. And actually what I've done here is I've listed the headlines that are in that board paper to give you a sense of what it's covering. And it's basically setting the argument out for why do you need a business recovery team and what are their responsibilities going to be, and how's this thing going to be structured, and a very useful document to refer to. Copies available. Just drop me a one-line email and I'll ping it straight back to you. Last bit on exiting lockdown was really just to re-raise this question that James Allen had posed a week ago, where he basically was saying, you know what, is there anything that you've changed to deal with COVID-19 that actually you now find yourself not wanting to go back to the old practices? What are the changes which you're likely to keep in place? Which I think is a great way of looking at this. There will be some things that we find that were just superfluous to our normal activities. So now we move to talking through the key threads, the key highlights from the week. There are 6 of them, I think. And the first one is on water consumption patterns. Now, obviously, what we're doing with these highlights is I'm picking and choosing the bits that we think are most relevant. Now, this one on water consumption was a paper that was shared by Canal de Isabel in Madrid. The paper's actually Spanish. So what we've done is we've read the paper and provided the highlights here. And it is worth taking sort of 90 seconds to just understand what they've done, because it's a really detailed study of water use in the home during the crisis. Now, the first thing to say is that in Madrid at the moment, April, they used less water in April than they did last year, about 6% less. And that's partly for a whole variety of reasons, but it might be partly to do with the fact that there's been quite a lot of rain in April, 25% more than is the normal average that is the normal amount. So I've got this thing that appears on my screen that I just can't get rid of. They then did this very detailed study of 300 homes with putting meters and sensors inside the home to look at the different water usage. And what they saw was actually a 16% decrease in washing machine usage and a 12% decrease in showers. Now, this is different to what we'd seen in some other data from other cities. And they then saw an increase in tap usage and dishwasher usage and toilet usage. Dishwasher usage going up by quite a lot, 20%. Now, drilling into the data, it's a very sort of culturally Spanish thing, I think, in that they found that the tap usage and dishwasher usage went up probably because people are spending much more time together as a family and enjoying meal times more. Toilet use has obviously gone up because people are at home, they're not in the office, and so they're using the toilets during the day rather than using the office toilets. You then get into drilling into that into a bit more detail. They saw that the shower usage has shifted from people having a morning shower. They've gone to nocturnal showers. It's become a nighttime thing. And the thoughts around using less water, using less for washing, is actually, well, people are just getting less dirty. There's less exercise, there's less movement, contact with pollution that's happening. And in fact, just people are just less dirty, so they're having shorter showers and they're doing less of their normal washing. Overall, consumption had increased by just 3.5%, just 10 litres per household. It is a very specific study, but it is the most detailed sort of case study that we've got shared. Hence the reason I thought it was useful to put here. There is the link to the Spanish paper if people would like to see it. Other bits on water consumption, Alain shared some information about theirs, where they've seen an increase. Again, much smaller than some of the data we've seen previously. Previously, we've been seeing some of the domestic usage being up at 20% levels. In our lane, it was only 1.8%, and that's even after they've got a new network into that particular part of the city of lots of villas. There may be a question around how many people are there. And then here's a question from Jerry Galvin at Irish Water, which was around, are people expecting, sorry, my slide jumped on there, are people expecting water usage to stay high, domestic water usage to stay high once everything mobilizes, everyone gets back to work, because there will be more people working from home. And so we might end up with that industry coming back up to the right levels, and yet domestic water usage, which, subject to the two examples I've just given, is usually quite high, will it still stay high? And if anyone's got any information or data or experience on that, it would be good to share it. Moving on, the second of the sort of highlights of the week was around both water conservation and some public image opportunities. So this was shared by Keely Carlton, who lives in Florida. Her role is as a sort of water conservation manager, and she noted that the number of complaints that she gets, her normal role involves answering the phone calls to customers who are saying my water bill is too high, and she then goes out and usually, she makes the point, usually what she's doing is she's helping people understand that the irrigation timer that they've got in their gardens has broken or gone faulty, and that's why they're using lots of water. And she proposes that maybe people are less concerned about water conservation because they're now at home and they're watering on demand. They're not relying on their timers. She does also, bless her, say maybe people are not worried about using more water because they know we're not shutting off customers, and people are relaxed about their bills because they've got lots of time to pay for it, which I think is an unlikely scenario, but you never know. She also makes the point that actually as we go through this epidemic, this crisis, lots of water companies have really set up their social media presence, and this is having a great positive impact, which I suspect we're seeing from a number of organizations. It will be good to share thoughts around that, share best practice. We'll come back to that when it gets to the subgroups bit. We then had someone shared, and I've anonymized the sharer because this can be a bit political. Someone shared a document that had been published in the New York Times, an article from the New York Times, which was basically saying, how do we fight COVID-19 when you don't have access to clean water? And it's political because this is actually an incredibly important issue. But it's been politicized a bit because it was obviously pointing the finger at some of the administration in the United States, and the article sort of saying, well, we've got lots of Americans who don't have access to clean water. It is actually an incredibly important point that we shouldn't overlook. How do people who don't have access to clean water wash their hands properly? The article does finish also by saying not only do we need to have good water for dealing with the virus, but actually investing in water infrastructure is going to be a key thing to help remobilize the economy once we come through this period, which I think is again a useful set of things to consider. Marco Fantozzi in Italy raised a question around whether there's a risk because of the intermittent water supply. We're going to have a risk of contamination due to infiltration from sewage. A few people have highlighted that, and that this is clearly a heightened risk area just because of how the network's being operated. So one to keep in mind, because I don't think people have been thinking about that as a potential area of concern. And then we come to one of the major topics that always gets covered here, which is COVID-19 in wastewater. So this recurs week on week, and we see a picture evolving. And there's always the question, constantly the question comes back as to, is the virus dangerous inside wastewater? And we seem to have a greater degree of evidence that no, in wastewater the virus is deactivated. And there's more evidence shared here around this. I've highlighted in green the bits that you wanted to really pull out of this. And you can see here that one at the bottom. We can expect little to no infectious viral load, even in raw sewage, after 24 hours. There is a lot more data and information there if you want to get into it, but it is worth reassuring your colleagues that the weight of evidence is that in wastewater, the virus is deactivated. Similar to that, Agua de Brazil shared, they operate 14 cities across Brazil, and they shared that they're looking into this area, and they're running a few trials and monitoring the coronavirus in the sewer network. It's in Portuguese, but again, we can help you translate that if needed. And then we come to the follow-on from this is, the question again, which has come up before, is, well, actually, if we can spot the RNA of the virus in the wastewater, can we use that to monitor and predict infection? And there was a lovely article that was actually published on the BBC that covered what Welsh Water are doing. Welsh Water, obviously in Wales, part of the UK, and how the University of Bangor is looking at samples and seeing how the outbreak sweeps across the country. Very similar to the things that were done a few weeks ago in the Netherlands. And there's a beautiful quote there from Steve Wilson, the MD of Welsh Water, on how they're using it to monitor the situation. And all of this is terribly reassuring, apart from this fact, which is the last bit on this one, which is actually Douglas Lumley from Griab in Sweden shared what they're doing. And they're doing a similar thing, and they're monitoring it. And what they've actually seen is the virus particles had, in general, stayed stable inside the wastewater samples. But in the last 2 weeks, there's been a 300 times increase in the amount that they're seeing in the incoming wastewater. And this is going to be both a terrifying yet also scientifically quite interesting situation to watch, in that this would suggest, if we're right in thinking that this is how we're monitoring, that we're going to use this as a monitor for the situation, then we've got a really interesting thing here, because it looks like maybe the public have eased off on the lockdown issues and they've stopped adhering to the rules, and we might be seeing this being the mark of a new wave. The document is available online, and I think we'll obviously be monitoring this and sharing it with you in these webinars. Then the last of the questions was around the handheld temperature sensors as a screening tool for staff and contractors. David Bergman raised this in Southeast Water. And we'd had a bit of an exchange around this last week around, temperature, it's one of many things to look at, is probably one of a suite of things to consider. And actually, the reason I've included it here, because I thought David Bergman sort of followed the debate and then added this just brilliant comment at the bottom, which is, actually, there's a psychological deterrent factor involved with doing this. If you're being present and using temperature sensors, it's just a sort of reminder to everybody, hey, hang on, there's a reason why we're doing this. And actually, I think that's again something to keep in mind when you're looking at these measures. So that is a bit of a gallop through the highlights from the week. Hopefully you found that useful. We have created some subgroups. So last week I invited you to consider joining one of three, or joining all three if you wanted to, subgroups. And this is partly because the WhatsApp group has reached full capacity. And so we started a technology group, a SARS in wastewater group, and then one for developing countries. Both the technology and the wastewater groups have been launched. We got to a sort of critical mass. I think for these groups, you've got to get to sort of 15 plus people for it to have enough activity to make it viable. The developing countries group hasn't yet reached critical mass. We're at seven people, and actually, there's been some suggestions that maybe we don't want a developing countries app, because that's a bit too narrow focus, but actually what we want is something on water affordability issues. Keely, as I mentioned earlier, from Florida, had said she'd find it useful if there was a water conservation app, and Neil Dock from Aquafed has actually suggested that maybe a lobbying or a comms group might be useful. So there's three other groups that have been proposed. There's two that are up running. Sorry, let me summarize it. There's two that are now up and running, one on technology and one on the virus in wastewater. There's one that's on hold around developing countries, which I personally think we should probably move to a water affordability initiative, which actually Yusuf Kabili from Baltimore proposed. And then there's two more that have been proposed on water conservation and lobbying. Now, the lobbying one, actually, Neil was very good in proposing this. He said, He'd like to do it under this current framework, so it will still come under what we're doing now, and all of those subgroups will feed into this webinar. So if you're sort of interested in those areas, but you just haven't got the time or the bandwidth to join yet another group, don't worry about it, because the things that are discussed there we will share on this weekly webinar. But the comms subgroup, the reason for why which is needed is basically by making sure that the industry in general is communicating the same messages, which strengthens our collective position. And the objective of this particular subgroup would be to agree those key messages and to identify the national and and international. Sorry. I've got to find a way of hiding this thing on my screen. Identifying the national and international stakeholders, and then clarifying the policy and regulatory changes that need to be communicated. So there's a nice sort of concept for that subgroup should you want to join it. Last few things to cover off. We always highlight the unanswered questions, or the ones which are particularly attracting information. And there's been a call for sharing around water safety plans. I know that there's quite a lot that happened overnight. I saw this morning, and someone had responded on the water safety plans, which we'll include in next week's webinar. And then again, just to remind you that the slide deck I circulate has the full library of all of the documents that have been shared in all of the previous 7 webinars. But we also highlight in this part of it key documents from this week. The one that's worth noting is the American Waterworks Association, and how they're sharing resources and webinars and research, return to service guidances. And there's a very useful website to refer to. With that, we'll jump to the final slide here, which is next steps. I hope you found that useful. I hope you've kept safe and well. The things I'd like you to consider this week is whether you want to join any of those subgroups we've talked about. Please keep sharing your lessons learned and your strategies on exiting lockdown. As noted last week, if anyone wants the sort of summary presentations, we've had a couple of approaches asking us to give a sort of overview of the last 2 months of findings. Very happy to provide those. And the very last comment is on the technology outreach proposal. We've now got a nice group of people working on that. If you want to join that group, there's another week's delay. It's actually started this week, but you can join any time for the next 2 weeks. I hope that was useful. I now see there's a few questions here, so I'll just quickly pull those up. They're just people saying good morning, and Noel in New Zealand saying good evening, just to make sure that. Thank you for that, Noel. Excellent. If there are no questions, or there's a few more just coming in now. Thank you for your comments. I really appreciate that. Can I wish you all a safe week, and thank you for your time. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks.